There are moments in a woman's life when cruelty and financial ruin converge so completely that survival itself becomes a luxury she can no longer afford. And for Miss Lillian Hayes, that moment arrived on a bright spring afternoon in the suffocating drawing room of Lady Penworth's tea, where the crystal teacups reflected harsh judgment upon 30 of London's most merciless gossips, and where she sat in her carefully mended lavender gown, her chestnut hair styled to hide the fraying ribbons, clutching the only source of unconditional love she had ever known. For 3 months, she had balanced on the knife's edge of respectability, navigating society with the desperate grace of a woman whose family's debts were whispered about in every corner, whose modest dowry had shrunk to nothing, and whose only crime was loving something small and innocent in a world that valued neither. And though Lily was not a woman of grand ambitions, she had allowed herself to believe that her gentle nature and tireless kindness might secure a modest marriage, that her reputation for compassion toward all creatures might offset the scandalous whispers about her father's failed investments. She was not a celebrated beauty who commanded ballrooms, but she possessed what her late grandmother called a tender heart, warm brown eyes that reflected genuine care for others, delicate features that suggested both fragility and quiet strength, and a softness of spirit that made even hardened servants confide in her. She had believed these qualities, combined with the fierce loyalty of the snow-white Maltese puppy nestled in her lap, might be enough to weather society's storms. And so when Lord Selwyn's voice cut through the polite murmur of tea conversation, her breath caught with dread, her fingers instinctively tightening around Pip's warm, trusting body. Instead, she found herself sitting paralyzed as Selwyn's words dripped like poison across the assembled ladies, announcing with theatrical malice that the Hayes family debts had reached catastrophic proportions, and that Miss Hayes's pathetic attachment to a mongrel puppy of questionable breeding was merely further evidence of her unsuitability for any respectable household, and that her laughable attempts to secure a marriage were destined to fail as completely as her father's business ventures, leaving her with nothing but a worthless dog and the certain future of genteel poverty. My beautiful family, before we continue with Lily's story, I need to tell you something that honestly hurts. 87% of you watching right now aren't subscribed. You'll spend the next hour invested in whether Lily and the Duke find love, whether Pip stays safe, whether broken hearts can heal. But you won't hit subscribe. And tomorrow, when I pour my soul into another story about love and protection and second chances, YouTube won't show it to you. You'll never know what happened. So right now, before you get attached to these characters, before you care about Pip's fate, subscribe. Because if you're the kind of person who roots for the underdog, who believes love can thaw frozen hearts, but you won't do the one free thing that costs you nothing to support these stories, what does that say? Subscribe now. Be among our most cherished first 1,000 subscribers. This story deserves witnesses who actually stay. The silence that followed was worse than any outcry. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her, some bright with schadenfreude, others dim with pity, but all reflecting the same inescapable truth. She was finished. Lady Penworth's lips pursed into a thin line of satisfaction, having clearly orchestrated this particular gathering for precisely this purpose. The woman's daughter had been competing for the same modest suitor Lily had dared to hope for, and now that competition was concluded before it had properly begun. Pip shifted in her arms, sensitive to the tension radiating through her body, and let out a small, questioning whimper. The sound cut through Lily's shock like a blade through silk. She looked down at the puppy's dark, trusting eyes, at the way his pink tongue darted out to lick her trembling fingers, at the complete and guileless devotion radiating from his small frame. He had no understanding of debts or dowries, of social ruin or cruel gossip. He knew only that she fed him, held him, loved him. And he loved her in return with the kind of pure, uncomplicated loyalty that no human had ever offered her. "How touching," Lord Selwyn continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "that she values a creature of such uncertain parentage. I've heard whispers that the animal was purchased from a common street vendor, not a proper breeder. Rather fitting, wouldn't you say? Damaged goods clinging to damaged goods." Several women laughed behind their fans. Mrs. Hartwick, who had once praised Lily's needlework, turned her face away entirely. Even Miss Caroline Winters, whom Lily had helped nurse through a terrible fever last winter, found sudden fascination with the pattern on her teacup. Lily felt the heat rising in her cheeks, the familiar burn of humiliation that she had experienced so often since her father's investments had crumbled into dust. But beneath the shame, something harder was crystallizing in her chest. She had endured whispers before. She had weathered pitying glances and withdrawn invitations. She had learned to smile through the casual cruelties of a society that measured worth in pounds and property. But this attack on the innocent creature in her arms, this attempt to strip away the one pure thing in her increasingly dark world, this she could not bear in silence. She rose from her chair with a grace that surprised even herself. Pip remained cradled against her chest, and she felt his tiny heartbeat fluttering against her palm like a captured bird. Around her, the drawing room seemed to contract, the walls pressing in with their damask paper and portrait-laden surfaces, the air thick with expensive perfume and cheaper malice. "You are quite right, Lord Selwyn," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I do value this creature. I value his honest affection above all the false civilities in this room. I value his loyalty above all the fair-weather friendships that vanish the moment one's fortune declines. And I value his gentle heart above all the cruel ones beating beneath silk waistcoats and expensive jewels." The shock on Selwyn's face was gratifying for precisely 3 seconds before his expression hardened into something ugly and vindictive. "How very sentimental. I wonder if such poetry will comfort you when you're residing in a debtor's cottage, Miss Hayes. Though I doubt they'll allow pets in such accommodations." The words hit her like a physical blow because they contained an edge of truth she had been avoiding for weeks. Her family's situation had deteriorated beyond mere embarrassment. The creditors were no longer making polite inquiries. The solicitors had begun using words like seizure and eviction. She had perhaps 3 months before even the small cottage in the country would be lost. 3 months before she would be forced to seek employment as a governess or companion, positions where a pet would indeed be impossible. 3 months before she would have to choose between her survival and Pip's. She looked down at the puppy once more, at his small body so full of trust and love, and felt something break open inside her chest. Not her heart, precisely. That had been cracking for months. No. This was something deeper. Something that lived beneath hope and pride and dignity. This was the foundational truth of who she was. A woman who would protect what she loved, regardless of cost. "Then I will find a way," she whispered, not to Selwyn or the assembled ladies, but to Pip himself. "I will trade anything, endure anything, accept any terms necessary to keep you safe." She walked through the drawing room with her head held high, ignoring the whispers that erupted in her wake like wildfire through dry grass. She did not look back at Lady Penworth's triumphant expression or Lord Selwyn's satisfied smirk. She thought only of the problem before her, turning it over with the methodical precision of a desperate woman. She needed protection, She needed resources. She needed power sufficient to shield one small, innocent life from a world determined to crush anything soft and vulnerable. She needed, though the thought made her stomach clench with dread, a marriage. Not the modest, comfortable match she had once hoped for, but something far more transactional. A bargain. A strategic alliance with someone wealthy enough and powerful enough that even Lord Selwyn's venom could not reach her. Someone cold enough not to care about affection or compatibility, but pragmatic enough to see value in a wife who would demand nothing beyond basic security. Someone who could give her what she needed. A fortress where Pip could live without fear. The cost of such protection would be everything she had once imagined for herself. Every foolish dream of companionship and understanding. But as Pip nestled deeper into her arms, trusting her completely to navigate the cruel waters of their shared existence, Lily knew the price was one she would pay without hesitation. After all, the truest measure of a person's worth was not found in grand romance or personal happiness, but in the lengths they would travel to protect one small, fluffy heart that beat in perfect synchrony with their own. The country cottage that had once seemed like a charming retreat now felt like a prison constructed of financial desperation and fading gentility. Lily had fled London 3 days after Lady Penworth's tea, traveling by public coach because the family carriage had been sold to satisfy one of the more insistent creditors. And she had spent those 72 hours in a fog of calculation and dread. The cottage sat at the edge of her family's former estate, the only property remaining after the sale of the main house. And it consisted of 4 cramped rooms with peeling wallpaper and a hearth that smoked when the wind blew from the east. Her mother had taken to her bed with nervous complaints, leaving Lily to manage the single remaining servant, Mrs. Dawes, whose wages were 3 months in arrears and whose loyalty was sustained only by the fact that she had nowhere else to go. Pip seemed to sense the change in their circumstances with the intuitive wisdom of small creatures. He stayed close to Lily's skirts, his usual playful energy muted, and at night he burrowed under the thin blankets of her narrow bed as though trying to burrow into her very skin. She found herself talking to him more in those dark hours, whispering plans and contingencies, knowing he understood nothing but the tone of her voice and the desperate love behind it. She had written 7 letters to 7 different men of her acquaintance, each one carefully crafted to suggest availability without appearing desperate, to hint at her situation without explicitly begging. She had received 3 responses. 2 were polite refusals that cited prior commitments or family obligations. The 3rd was from Mr. Pemberton, a widower of 53 with 6 children and a reputation for parsimony, who had offered her a position as governess to his daughters rather than marriage, noting that her circumstances made her eminently suitable for such employment, and that pets were naturally forbidden in a household devoted to proper education. She had burned that letter in the smoking hearth and watched the flames consume her last shred of optimism. It was on the 4th afternoon, as she sat mending her only remaining evening gown by the weak light from the window, that Mrs. Dawes burst into the sitting room with an expression that combined terror and awe in equal measure. "Miss Lily, there's a gentleman arrived. A duke." The woman's voice dropped to a scandalized whisper. "The Duke of Ashford. He's asking for you specifically." Lily's needle slipped, pricking her finger. A small bead of blood welled up, bright red against her pale skin. Duke Corvus Beaumont. Even she, isolated as she had been from the highest circles of society, knew that name. The wealthiest peer in England. The man whose business acumen had turned an already substantial fortune into something approaching mythical. The bachelor, whose cold refusal of every marriage-minded mama's daughter had become legendary. The man whom society whispered about in tones that mixed respect with an undercurrent of fear. "Show him in," she said, her voice steadier than her hands. She set aside the mending, tucked Pip into a basket near the hearth with a stern whisper to stay quiet, and arranged herself on the worn settee with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. When Duke Corvus Beaumont entered the cramped sitting room, the space seemed to contract around his presence. He was taller than she had imagined, with dark hair swept back from a face that could have been carved from marble for all the warmth it displayed. His clothes were impeccable without being ostentatious, his bearing that of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose. But it was his eyes that arrested her attention, gray as a winter dawn and just as cold, assessing her with the kind of dispassionate calculation one might use when evaluating livestock at market. "Miss Hayes." His voice was deep, controlled, utterly devoid of inflection. "I trust you know who I am." "Your Grace." She rose and curtsied, the movement automatic despite her racing thoughts. "Your visit is unexpected." "I prefer efficiency to social niceties." He did not sit, did not even remove his gloves. "I have heard of your circumstances. I have also heard of Lord Selwyn's recent campaign to ensure your complete social destruction. The man is vindictive and thorough. I'll grant him that much." The casual assessment of her ruin should have stung, but Lily found herself too shocked by his presence to feel anything beyond numb confusion. "May I ask why this concerns your Grace?" "It concerns me because I have need of a wife, and you have need of protection." He stated this as though discussing a business transaction, which, she realized with growing clarity, was precisely how he viewed it. "I am 37. My family has been pressuring me to secure the succession for the better part of a decade. I find the prospect of courtship tedious and the current crop of marriage-minded young women insufferable in their ambitions. You, Miss Hayes, are in no position to harbor grand expectations or make tiresome emotional demands." The bluntness of it stole her breath. She had anticipated many possible scenarios in her desperate imaginings, but not this. Not a proposal delivered with the warmth of a contract negotiation. "I see." She forced herself to meet those cold gray eyes. "And what would your Grace expect in return for this protection?" "A wife who understands her role. A duchess who can manage my household with competence and discretion. A woman who will not fill my halls with dramatics or require constant attention." He paused, and something in his expression hardened further, if such a thing were possible. "I value order above all things, Miss Hayes. My life is structured according to precise routines and expectations. I will not tolerate disruptions. I am quite capable of maintaining a well-ordered household, Your Grace. I am aware of your reputation for gentle competence. It is one of the reasons I have come." His gaze swept the shabby room, cataloging its poverty with clinical precision. "However, there are certain standards that must be maintained at Beaumont Hall. My home is not a sanctuary for sentimentality or frivolous attachments. I maintain no pets. I permit no unnecessary clutter. I expect punctuality, discretion, and above all, an understanding that my requirements take precedence." The words hit her like ice water. No pets. She felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack, felt the desperate plan she had been building collapse before it had properly formed. From the basket by the hearth, she heard a small, sleepy yawn, and she coughed deliberately to mask the sound. "Those terms seem quite reasonable, Your Grace." His eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment she thought he had detected the lie. But then he nodded, apparently satisfied. "You will have your own apartments. I will provide a generous allowance for your personal needs and for your mother's care. Your family's debts will be settled in full. In return, you will fulfill the duties of a duchess and refrain from interfering with my affairs. We need not pretend affection or companionship beyond what public appearances require. It was, she realized, the best offer she would ever receive. Perhaps the only offer. The alternative was destitution, the workhouse for her mother. And Pip surrendered to whatever fate awaited unwanted animals in a world that had no patience for creatures that could not earn their keep. She thought of Pip's trusting eyes, of his small body pressed against hers in the cold nights, of the promise she had made to protect him, regardless of cost. The Duke had said no pets were permitted at Beaumont Hall. He had not said no pets could enter. The distinction was small, but in that narrow space lived her only hope. I accept your terms, Your Grace. Something flickered across his face, too quick to identify. Relief, perhaps, or satisfaction at having concluded a troublesome transaction efficiently. We will marry by special license within the week. I will send my solicitor tomorrow to manage the arrangements and settle your family's accounts. My carriage will collect you in 5 days' time. He turned to leave, his business concluded, but paused at the doorway. Miss Hayes, I trust you understand the nature of what we are undertaking. This is not a romantic union. It is a practical solution to mutual needs. I expect you to honor the terms we have discussed. I understand perfectly, Your Grace. The lie tasted like ashes on her tongue. After he departed, the cottage seemed larger somehow, as though his commanding presence had been the only thing holding the walls together. Lily sank onto the settee and pulled Pip from his basket, burying her face in his soft fur as the full weight of what she had done settled over her like a burial shroud. She had 5 days to devise a way to smuggle her most precious possession into the cold, ordered fortress of a man who valued control above all else. 5 days to plan a deception that, if discovered, would destroy the fragile protection she had just secured. But as Pip licked the tears from her cheeks with his small pink tongue, she knew she would find a way. She had traded her chance at happiness for his safety. Now she would trade her honesty as well. After all, what was one more sacrifice when weighed against one small, trusting life? The wedding took place in the private chapel of Beaumont Hall on a gray morning that seemed designed to match the emotional temperature of the proceedings. Lily wore a gown of ivory silk that the Duke's modiste had delivered 2 days prior, elegant and expensive and utterly impersonal. The kind of dress that could have belonged to any woman of any temperament. There were no flowers beyond the sparse arrangements that decorated the chapel year-round. No music beyond the perfunctory organ notes that accompanied their vows, no guests beyond the Duke's solicitor and his ancient housekeeper who served as witnesses. Her mother had been too unwell to travel, a convenient excuse that masked her horror at her daughter's hasty marriage to a man rumored to have ice where his heart should be. Duke Corvus Beaumont stood beside her at the altar with the same expression he might have worn while reviewing quarterly accounts. His responses to the vicar's prompts delivered in that controlled baritone that betrayed nothing of thought or feeling. When the moment came to place the ring upon her finger, his hands were steady and cold, the heavy gold band sliding into place with mechanical precision. The kiss that sealed their union lasted precisely 3 seconds, his lips touching hers with the clinical brevity of a man fulfilling a contractual obligation. And then he stepped back, the transaction complete. Your Grace, he said, the title now hers. And she heard no warmth in it, only acknowledgement of a change in her legal status. The wedding breakfast was similarly efficient. A meal consumed in near silence in the formal dining room, while servants moved like ghosts around them. The Duke inquired after her comfort during the journey from the cottage, asked if the accommodations prepared, for her mother were satisfactory and confirmed that his solicitor had settled all outstanding debts as promised. She answered each question with equal formality, painfully aware of the chasm of silence that existed between the words, the vast emotional distance that stretched across the mahogany table despite their physical proximity. When the meal concluded, the Duke rose with the kind of fluid economy of movement that suggested a man always conscious of efficiency. "I have business matters requiring my attention this afternoon. Mrs. Rothwell will show you to your apartments and familiarize you with the household routines. I dine at 7 o'clock precisely. I expect you will join me this evening, after which we will establish a schedule that minimizes unnecessary disruption to our respective days." And with that, her husband of 3 hours departed, his footsteps echoing down the marble hallway with the steady rhythm of a man whose life would continue exactly as it had before, save for the inconvenient addition of a wife. Mrs. Rothwell, the housekeeper who had witnessed their vows, proved to be a woman of perhaps 60 years, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that assessed Lily with the same clinical precision the Duke had employed. "If you'll follow me, Your Grace, I'll show you to the Duchess's apartments. They haven't been occupied in 15 years, not since the late Duchess passed, but we've aired them thoroughly and made them as comfortable as circumstances allow." The route through Beaumont Hall felt like a journey through a museum dedicated to wealth and restraint. Every surface gleamed with obsessive care, every painting hung at precise intervals, every vase and sculpture positioned with mathematical exactitude. There was beauty in it, certainly, the kind of cold perfection that came from unlimited resources applied with rigid discipline. But there was no warmth, no sense that human beings actually lived within these pristine walls. Lily found herself counting the doors they passed, noting the turns, mentally mapping the sprawling manor with the careful attention of someone planning a campaign. The Duchess's apartments occupied the entire eastern wing of the second floor, a suite of rooms so vast that Lily's entire cottage could have fit within them twice over. Mrs. Rothwell opened the door to reveal a sitting room decorated in shades of blue and cream, elegant furniture arranged in conversational groupings that had likely never hosted actual conversation. Windows that overlooked formal gardens maintained with the same rigid precision as everything else in this fortress of order. "Your bedchamber is through there." Mrs. Rothwell gestured to a door on the left. "Your dressing room and private bathroom beyond that. The Duke's apartments are in the west wing. You need not concern yourself with that section of the house." The message was clear. Separate lives, separate spaces, separate existences that intersected only when social obligation demanded. Lily felt something twist in her chest, not quite grief because she had never harbored illusions about this marriage, but a strange sort of relief. Distance meant privacy. Privacy meant space for secrets. "The rooms are lovely, Mrs. Rothwell. Thank you." The housekeeper's expression softened marginally. The first hint of humanity Lily had detected in this cold place. "If you have any questions about household matters, Your Grace, I'm at your disposal. The Duke runs a tight ship, as they say, but he's fair in his expectations. Keep to his schedule and his standards, and you'll find life here tolerable enough." After Mrs. Rothwell departed, Lily stood alone in the center of her new domain, listening to the profound silence that filled these rooms like water filling a vessel. She had perhaps an hour before she needed to concern herself with dinner preparations. An hour before she had to don the mask of the competent, unobtrusive Duchess her husband expected. She used that hour to retrieve Pip from the specially designed compartment in her largest trunk, a space she had lined with soft blankets and equipped with air holes disguised among the decorative brass fixtures. The puppy emerged confused and frightened, having spent hours in darkness and uncertainty, and she held him close while he trembled against her chest. "We're safe now," she whispered into his soft fur, though she wasn't certain which of them she was trying to convince. "This is our home now. You must be very quiet, very good. No one can know you're here." She established his sanctuary in the dressing room, a space so large that it accommodated her modest wardrobe with room to spare. Behind a decorative screen, she arranged blankets and water bowls, positioned his favorite toys where he could reach them, created a comfortable prison for the small creature whose presence could destroy the fragile security she had purchased with her name and her honesty. The following days settled into a pattern of careful deception and rigid routine. Lily woke before dawn to exercise Pip in the shadowed corners of the gardens, while the household still slept, smuggled food from the breakfast table in her napkin, spent her evenings in her apartments where she could let him run freely without fear of discovery. During the daylight hours, she threw herself into her duties as Duchess with the fervor of someone trying to earn a place she had claimed through subterfuge. She met with Mrs. Rothwell to review household accounts, demonstrating a competence with figures that made the housekeeper's eyebrows rise in surprised approval. She inspected the kitchens, the storerooms, the linens, offering suggestions that improved efficiency without disrupting the established order the Duke prized so highly. She reorganized the still room, updated the inventory of the wine cellar, and drafted a schedule for the rotating maintenance of the various reception rooms that would ensure they remained pristine without wasting resources. The Duke, when she saw him at dinner each evening, seemed satisfied with her performance. Their conversations remained formal, limited to household matters and the occasional discussion of estate business where her input was relevant. He never inquired about her days beyond confirming that she had what she needed. He never asked about her thoughts or her feelings. He never touched her beyond the occasional brush of fingers when he handed her from the carriage during their weekly attendance at church, a public appearance that satisfied the expectations of their position. It was, she supposed, exactly what he had promised. A marriage of convenience and order, devoid of the messy complications of emotion or intimacy. But alone in her apartments at night, with Pip curled against her side, Lily felt the weight of her dual existence pressing down like a physical thing. She was living a lie in a house that valued truth expressed through rigid adherence to rules. She was harboring softness and vulnerability in a place designed to eliminate both. She was, in essence, smuggling her own heart past guards who would see it as contraband if they knew to look for it. And yet, as Pip's small heartbeat pulsed against her palm in the darkness, she could not bring herself to regret the bargain she had struck. Better to live a lie in safety than to speak the truth in destitution. Better to hide what she loved than to lose it to a world that had no patience for creatures that required protection rather than providing profit. She only hoped the walls of her beautiful prison would prove thick enough to contain her secret indefinitely. My sweet family, you just watched the Duke bring food for Pip with his own hands. A man so broken he couldn't feel for 30 years just chose tenderness. And I need you to be honest with yourself right now. Are you really going to watch this entire love story? Feel everything I'm making you feel? Cry when Corvus finally breaks down, and then leave without subscribing? You're going to take this emotional journey for free and give nothing back? Look, I've spent days crafting every word of this story, perfecting every emotional beat, making sure Lily and Corvus and Pip burrow into your heart. The only thing I ask, the only thing, is that you subscribe. It's one click. 1 second of effort. If you can't do that after I've given you this much, then honestly, you're taking something precious and offering nothing in return. Don't be that person. Subscribe right now. Let's continue with the story. The library at Beaumont Hall was the one room in the entire manor where Lily had begun to feel something approaching peace. Unlike the formal drawing rooms, with their rigid furniture arrangements, and the dining room with its oppressive silence, the library possessed a quality of accumulated knowledge that softened its edges. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines creating a tapestry of burgundy and forest green and midnight blue. And the air held that particular scent of old paper and binding glue that spoke of ideas preserved across generations. The Duke had granted her permission to use the space during his business hours, and she had fallen into the habit of spending her afternoons there, reading in the window seat while afternoon light filtered through the leaded glass. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, 3 weeks into her marriage, that disaster struck with the swift inevitability of a nightmare. She had returned to her apartments to retrieve a shawl, leaving the library door slightly ajar, a careless mistake born of growing comfort. What she had not anticipated was that one of the chambermaids, in an excess of diligence, would open the dressing room door to air the space, nor that Pip, who had been sleeping peacefully among his blankets, would see this as an opportunity for adventure. By the time Lily returned to the library, shawl in hand, she discovered the door to the hallway standing open and Pip nowhere to be found in her apartments. The panic that seized her chest was immediate and absolute. She moved through the corridors with forced calm, her mind racing through terrible possibilities. A servant discovering him. Mrs. Rothwell reporting the breach of household rules to the Duke. Her husband's cold fury at her deception. The marriage annulled. The protection withdrawn. Everything she had sacrificed rendered meaningless in an instant. She heard the small, distinctive yap before she saw him. A sound that froze her blood in her veins. It came from the library, from the very room she had just vacated. And as she approached the doorway, her worst fears crystallized into terrible reality. The Duke stood in the center of the library, still dressed in his riding clothes, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the wind, and at his feet sat Pip, tail wagging with the enthusiastic obliviousness of a creature who had never learned to fear anything. The puppy looked up at the tall, imposing figure with absolute delight, as though he had discovered a new and fascinating person to love, as though the man staring down at him were not the arbiter of his continued existence. Lily's hand flew to her throat, pressing against the pulse that hammered there with sickening force. She waited for the explosion of anger, for the cold dismissal, for the words that would confirm her greatest fears. Instead, the Duke simply stood there, motionless as a statue, his expression locked in something that transcended mere surprise into a territory she could not identify. "Your Grace," she began, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "I can explain." But the Duke did not appear to hear her. His gray eyes remained fixed on Pip with an intensity that was almost physical. And in that frozen moment, Lily saw something flicker across his face, a hairline crack in the marble facade he presented to the world. It was gone too quickly to name, but it had been there, she was certain of it. Some emotion powerful enough to breach his legendary control. Pip, utterly oblivious to the tension radiating through the room, took the Duke's stillness as an invitation. The puppy trotted forward on his small white paws and pressed his nose against the Duke's boot, sniffing with the intense curiosity of a creature exploring new territory. Then, with the kind of fearless affection that only small dogs and very young children possess, Pip rose up on his hind legs, bracing his front paws against the Duke's leg, and stretched upward as though trying to reach the hand that hung motionless at the man's side. "Pip." "No," Lily breathed, taking a step forward. But the Duke's hand moved before she could intervene. He lowered it slowly, almost mechanically, and Pip immediately seized the opportunity to lick the gloved fingers with enthusiastic devotion, his small pink tongue working across the leather as though this cold, imposing man were the most wonderful thing he had ever encountered. The Duke's hand remained suspended there, neither pulling away nor responding, frozen in the moment of contact, as though he had been turned to stone by some ancient curse. Lily watched, her heart hammering against her ribs as several seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Then, with a movement that seemed to require tremendous effort, the Duke withdrew his hand. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the glove carefully, methodically, removing any trace of the puppy's affection with the same precision he applied to all things. But his hand, Lily noticed, trembled slightly, a barely perceptible shake that belied the rigid control of his expression. "Your Grace, she began again. But this time he raised his free hand to silence her, still not meeting her eyes. "How long?" His voice emerged rough, as though something had lodged in his throat. "Since we married. I smuggled him in my trunk." There was no point in lying now, not when the evidence sat at his feet, tail still wagging hopefully. "I know you forbade pets. I know I violated the terms of our agreement, but I could not abandon him. He has no one else." The Duke's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin, and finally his gaze lifted from the puppy to meet hers. What she saw in those gray eyes stole her breath for entirely different reasons than fear. There was no anger there, no cold fury at her deception. Instead, there was something raw and unguarded, something that looked almost like pain, as though the sight of the small, affectionate creature had torn open some old wound he had thought long healed. "What is his name?" The question emerged after a long silence, and the fact that he asked at all seemed more shocking than any outburst of rage would have been. "Pip, Your Grace." "Pip," he repeated, the word strange on his lips, as though he were testing an unfamiliar language. He looked down at the puppy again, and Lily saw his hand move slightly, an aborted gesture that might have been the beginning of reaching down, of touching the small creature who gazed up at him with such uncomplicated trust. But the movement stopped before it began, his control reasserting itself with visible effort. "Keep him confined to your apartments," he said finally, his voice returning to its usual flat precision, though something in it remained unsteady, like a foundation that had been shaken but not quite toppled. "See that he does not disrupt the household routines. If he causes damage or creates disturbances, he will be removed." The words should have felt like a victory, like a reprieve from execution, but Lily found herself fixated on the way his hand still held the handkerchief, gripping it with white-knuckled intensity, and on the careful distance he maintained from the puppy who continued to gaze up at him with adoring expectation. "Thank you, Your Grace. You are more generous than I deserve." "I am not generous, madam. I am practical." But even as he spoke, his eyes drifted back to Pip, and Lily saw it again, that flicker of something beneath the ice, like movement glimpsed beneath a frozen lake. Small creatures require care and consistency. Their needs are simple but absolute. Neglect them, and they suffer. It would be inefficient to force you to make such a choice. The explanation was perfectly logical, perfectly in keeping with the character of a man who valued order and efficiency above all else. But Lily had seen his face in that moment when Pip had first licked his hand, had seen the way his control had wavered like a candle flame in a sudden draft. And she knew with absolute certainty that there was more to his response than mere practicality. "I will ensure he causes no disruption, Your Grace." The Duke nodded once, sharply, and turned toward the door. But before he left, he paused, his back still to her, his shoulders rigid with tension. Your apartments have a small terrace overlooking the eastern gardens. They are private and rarely used by the household. It would be suitable for such a creature's exercise, more suitable than the hallways. And then he was gone, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with their usual measured cadence, leaving Lily standing in the library with Pip circling her skirts and 100 questions burning in her chest. She bent to scoop up the puppy, holding him close as her racing heart began to slow. She should feel relief, and part of her did. The Duke had not cast her out. He had not demanded she remove Pip. He had, against all expectation, granted permission for the small creature to remain. But what lingered in her mind was not gratitude, but curiosity, sharp and insistent as a thorn. She kept seeing the Duke's face in that moment of contact, the way his carefully constructed facade had cracked just enough to reveal something underneath. Pain, perhaps, or memory, or something else. Entirely, some emotion so carefully buried that even its owner might not recognize it if confronted directly. "What did you see in him?" she whispered to Pip, stroking his soft fur. "What did you make him remember?" The puppy had no answers, only his usual uncomplicated affection, pressing his small body against hers as though to reassure her that all was well. But as Lily carried him back to the safety of her apartments, she found herself thinking not about her own relief, but about the Duke's trembling hand, about the way he had wiped away Pip's kiss as though it burned, about the careful distance he maintained from anything that might demand his heart rather than his discipline. And for the first time since entering this cold, perfect fortress, she wondered what wounds her husband carried beneath his armor of ice, and whether they might be even deeper than her own. The transformation of Beaumont Hall's staff from polite wariness to genuine warmth happened so gradually that Lily scarcely noticed it until Mrs. Rothwell appeared at her sitting room door one morning with tea and a tentative smile. It had begun with small gestures, she supposed, the kind of ordinary kindnesses that cost nothing, but meant everything to people accustomed to being invisible. She had learned the names of every housemaid and footman within her first week, inquired after the scullery maid's sick mother, noticed when the second footman favored his left leg, and quietly arranged for the doctor to examine what turned out to be a badly healing sprain. She did not do these things for strategic purposes, but because it had never occurred to her to treat servants as anything less than human beings worthy of consideration. The cook, Mrs. Brennan, had been won over when Lily ventured into the kitchens to compliment a particularly delicate pastry and stayed to discuss the merits of various spice combinations, revealing a knowledge of culinary arts that came from years of helping her own family's cook stretch meager ingredients into palatable meals. The head gardener, old Hitchens, had softened when she asked permission before cutting flowers from his precious beds, and then spent an hour listening to his passionate discourse on the proper cultivation of roses. Even stern Mrs. Rothwell had thawed after Lily quietly reorganized the household accounts in a way that saved money without reducing quality, then credited the housekeeper's management for the improved efficiency. "The staff speak quite highly of your grace," Mrs. Rothwell said as she poured the tea, her tone careful but warm. "They say you have a gentle way about you. It's a quality that's been missing from this house for a very long time." Lily accepted the cup with a murmured thanks, unsure how to respond to praise that felt both gratifying and dangerous. Gentleness, after all, was precisely what the Duke had not wanted when he selected her for this position. He had wanted efficiency and order, not the messy complications of human warmth. Yet it was the Duke himself who began to seek her company with increasing frequency. It started with supper, which had always been a formal affair conducted in near silence. But one evening in the 4th week of their marriage, as she was preparing to rise from the table after the final course, he had spoken. "I understand you have been reading Bentham's work on utilitarianism from the library." She had frozen, surprised both by his knowledge of her reading habits and by his willingness to engage in conversation beyond the perfunctory. "Yes, Your Grace. I find his arguments compelling, though somewhat troubling in their implications." "Troubling how?" He had leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes focused on her with an intensity that was different from his usual clinical assessment. This was genuine curiosity. "He reduces human happiness to a calculation, as though joy and suffering could be measured with the precision of accounting ledgers. It seems to me that such an approach ignores the particular nature of individual experience. And yet, without some framework for measurement, how do we make moral decisions that benefit the greatest number?" The debate that followed had lasted nearly an hour, ranging across philosophy and ethics and the practical applications of abstract principles. Lily found herself forgetting to be careful, forgetting to maintain the deferential distance she had cultivated, drawn out by the unexpected discovery that her husband possessed not only a formidable intellect, but a genuine willingness to engage with ideas that challenged his own positions. He did not agree with many of her arguments, but he listened with an attention that felt like respect. And when he countered her points, he did so with the precision of someone who had actually considered what she said, rather than dismissing it out of hand. After that evening, supper became something other than an obligation. The Duke began requesting her company with increasing regularity, and their conversations expanded to encompass literature, politics, the management of the estate, and even the occasional venture into more personal territory. She learned that he rose at 5 every morning without fail, that he found social gatherings tedious but necessary, that he had learned to play the pianoforte as a child but had not touched the instrument in 20 years. He learned that she preferred novels to poetry, that she had a gift for mathematics that had gone largely unused, that she missed the simplicity of country life more than she had anticipated. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The Duke, who had married her with the emotional investment of a man purchasing a new horse, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming a man who noticed what she thought and how she reasoned. The walls he had constructed between them remained formidable, but hairline cracks had begun to appear, letting through small shafts of light. It was during one of her morning walks with Pip on the terrace the Duke had recommended that Lily first noticed the broken fence. A section of the decorative iron railing that bordered the eastern gardens had come loose from its moorings, creating a gap large enough for a small dog to slip through. She made a mental note to inform Mrs. Rothwell, but before she could do so, she encountered the head groom, Matthews, in the hallway outside her apartments. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace," the man said, touching his cap respectfully. "I was just coming to inform you that the fence along the eastern garden has been inspected and will be repaired this afternoon. His Grace noticed the damage this morning and wanted it addressed immediately." Lily felt a small flutter in her chest, a sensation she could not quite name. That was very observant of His Grace. Well, the Duke misses nothing when it comes to the maintenance of the estate." Matthews shifted his weight, looking slightly uncomfortable. "If you'll excuse me, Your Grace, I need to get back to the stables." She let him go, but curiosity drew her toward the window that overlooked the courtyard. From this vantage point, she could see the Duke speaking with Matthews near the carriage house, their figures small but distinct in the morning light. She could not hear their words, but she watched as the Duke gestured toward something, his posture radiating the same controlled authority he brought to every interaction. The window was old, one of the original casements that predated the more modern additions to the house, and it sat slightly ajar. Whether by accident or providence, sound carried more clearly than it should have through that narrow gap. And Lily found herself catching fragments of the conversation below. "Not merely," repaired Matthews, replaced entirely with something more substantial. The Duke's voice drifted upward, crisp and decisive. "More substantial, Your Grace?" The groom's confusion was evident even from this distance. "I want iron railings with narrower spacing. Something that would prevent a pause, so slight that someone who did not know him might have missed it. Something that even a small creature could not slip through. It would be irresponsible to maintain a barrier that fails in its purpose." "Of course, Your Grace. I'll see to it personally." Lily's hand pressed against the window frame as she watched the Duke turn away, his shoulders rigid, his gait as measured and controlled as ever. But her mind was racing, replaying those words, that slight hesitation before "small creature," the care he had taken to frame his concern in terms of responsibility and efficiency rather than any softer emotion. He had noticed the broken fence because of Pip. He was repairing it, no, replacing it entirely, not because it offended his sense of order, but because he feared the puppy might escape through the gap and come to harm. The realization settled over her like a warm cloak on a cold evening, unexpected and deeply affecting. Later that day, she mentioned the fence repair over supper, carefully casual in her tone. "I understand there was damage to the eastern garden railing. Thank you for addressing it so promptly, Your Grace." The Duke did not look up from his plate. It was a hazard. Hazards must be eliminated. Of course, most practical. But when she dared to glance at him, she caught the briefest tightening around his eyes, a tell so subtle that she might have imagined it if she had not been watching so carefully. He knew that she knew, and he could not quite hide his discomfort at having been caught in an act of what could only be described as consideration. That night, alone in her apartments with Pip curled against her side, Lily found herself staring at the ceiling and thinking not about her own situation, but about her husband's. Each small revelation felt like a piece of a puzzle she was assembling without benefit of the picture on the box. The way he had frozen when Pip licked his hand, the tremor in his fingers as he wiped away the contact. The fence that must be strong enough to contain even a small creature. The increasing frequency of their conversations, as though he were drawn to something in her company despite his determination to maintain distance. She thought about what Mrs. Rothwell had said, about gentleness being missing from this house for a very long time. She thought about the Duke's admission that he had not played the pianoforte in 20 years, the way he said it with such finality, as though some door had closed and could never be reopened. She thought about a man who had built his entire existence around control and order and the elimination of anything that might demand emotional vulnerability. And she wondered what it must cost him, this life of rigid discipline. She wondered what he might have been before he became the cold Duke, before he learned to turn himself into marble. She wondered if somewhere beneath all that ice, a different man was trapped, frozen in place by old wounds and older fears. Pip stirred in his sleep, making a small contented sound, and Lily stroked his soft fur with gentle fingers. "He's trying," she whispered to the puppy. "In his own way, he's trying to keep you safe, even if he can't admit why it matters." And perhaps, she thought, as sleep began to claim her, that was enough for now. Perhaps the cracks in the ice were widening, slowly but surely, letting warmth seep through one small gesture at a time. The confession came not from planning, but from necessity, from a moment when truth became impossible to avoid. Lily had been managing the deception with careful precision for 6 weeks, maintaining the fiction that Pip existed only as an abstract permission granted and then forgotten. But on a rain-swept evening in early autumn, as she descended the main staircase for supper, she heard it. The distinctive, plaintive whimpering of a small dog in distress, echoing from somewhere above with a clarity that no amount of closed doors could muffle. She froze on the landing, her heart seizing in her chest. Pip had been perfectly content when she left him, settled on his blankets with his favorite toy. But something had clearly changed, and now his cries carried through the halls of Beaumont Hall with the unmistakable urgency of a creature in pain or fear. Behind her, she heard the measured footsteps of the Duke ascending from his study, drawn by the same sound that had arrested her progress. "What is that noise?" His voice held no anger yet, only the sharp attention of a man alert to disruption in his ordered domain. Lily turned to face him, watching as understanding dawned across his features. The whimpering continued, punctuated now by small, frantic barks. And there was no possibility of pretense, no way to claim the sound came from outside or from some other source. The Duke's eyes moved from her face to the upper floor, then back again, and she saw the moment when the abstract permission he had granted crystallized into the concrete reality of an animal living under his roof. "I must check on him," she said quietly, abandoning any attempt at evasion. "He sounds distressed." The Duke followed her up the stairs without a word, his presence at her back like a physical weight. By the time they reached her apartments, Pip's cries had escalated to near hysteria. And when she opened the door to her dressing room, she found him cowering beneath a chair, trembling violently. A crash of thunder rolled across the estate, shaking the windows in their frames, and the puppy's fear became immediately comprehensible. "He's terrified of storms," Lily murmured, kneeling to coax him out from his hiding place. "Has been since he was tiny. I should have anticipated this." Pip emerged slowly, his small body quaking, and immediately pressed himself against her with the desperate trust of a creature who knew only one source of safety in a frightening world. She gathered him into her arms, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her chest, murmuring soft reassurances as another peal of thunder sent him burrowing closer. When she finally looked up, she found the Duke standing in the doorway of her dressing room, his expression impossible to read. He had never entered her private spaces before, had maintained strict boundaries even in this marriage of convenience. Now he stood among her belongings, surrounded by the evidence of her deception. The blankets arranged in a corner, the water bowl, the scattered toys that spoke of a life lived entirely in secret. "Your Grace, I know this violates," she began, but he raised a hand to silence her. "Why?" The word emerged flat, carefully controlled, but beneath it she heard something that might have been genuine confusion. "You have risked my displeasure, maintained an elaborate deception, lived in constant fear of discovery. Why?" "He is merely an animal." Thus, question hung in the air between them. Heavy with implications she had not expected to confront, Lily looked down at Pip, who had begun to calm in her arms, his trust in her protection absolute and unquestioning. When she spoke, the truth emerged with a rawness that surprised her. "Because he is the only thing that has never judged me." Her voice caught slightly, but she forced herself to continue, to meet the Duke's gray eyes with honesty she had been too careful to offer before. "My entire life, I have been measured and found wanting. My dowry was too small. My connections were insufficient. My accomplishments were dismissed as inadequate. When my father's investments failed, society turned on me like wolves scenting weakness. Lord Selwyn destroyed what remained of my reputation with casual cruelty, and no one defended me because I was not worth the social capital such a defense would cost." Another crash of thunder, and Pip whimpered against her neck. She stroked his fur with automatic tenderness, the gesture grounding her as she spoke truths she had never articulated aloud. "But Pip has never cared about my dowry or my family's debts. He has never judged me for my failures or found me lacking in social graces. He loves me because I feed him and hold him and keep him warm. His affection is not contingent on my worth in society's eyes. It is freely given, without calculation or conditions. She felt her throat tighten, but refused to look away from the Duke's penetrating gaze. In a world that has made it abundantly clear that I am insufficient, he makes me feel as though I am enough. That is worth any risk, Your Grace. That is worth any deception. The silence that followed felt profound, broken only by the rain lashing against the windows and Pip's gradually slowing breaths. The Duke remained motionless in the doorway, his face carved into an expression of such careful blankness that Lily knew with sudden certainty that her words had struck something deep and undefended. "I see," he said finally, and his voice emerged rougher than usual, as though scraped across something sharp. "That is, I understand the logic of your position." He turned abruptly, leaving her dressing room with swift strides, and for a terrible moment Lily thought she had revealed too much, that her confession of vulnerability had repulsed him. But he paused at the door to her sitting room, his back rigid with tension. "You will join me for supper?" It was phrased as a question, but his tone suggested uncertainty rather than command, as though he were suddenly unsure of his welcome in her company. "Of course, Your Grace. Once the storm passes and Pip has calmed, I will bring him." The words emerged quickly, almost forcefully, and the Duke's shoulders tensed further, as though he had surprised himself with a directive. "If he provides you comfort during the storm, it would be impractical to separate you. We will dine in the small parlor rather than the formal dining room, more suitable for informal circumstances." And then he was gone, leaving Lily staring after him, with Pip warm in her arms and 100 questions burning in her chest. The supper that followed was unlike any meal they had shared. The small parlor lived up to its name, a space perhaps a quarter the size of the formal dining room, with a round table that forced a more intimate proximity. The Duke had changed from his formal attire into something less severe, and he maintained an unusual silence through the first course, his attention fixed on his plate with deliberate intensity. Pip, recovering from his storm-induced terror, sat on a cushion Lily had brought from her rooms, occasionally letting out small, contented sounds as he watched them eat. She fed him bits of bread beneath the table, expecting the Duke to comment on the impropriety. But he said nothing, though she noticed his gaze drift toward the puppy with unsettling frequency. They were nearly finished with the main course when the Duke rose abruptly, startling both Lily and Pip with the sudden movement. "Excuse me a moment," he murmured, and left the room before she could respond. He returned several minutes later, carrying a small porcelain plate bearing several slices of venison, cooked rare and cut into pieces appropriate for a creature with a very small mouth. He set the plate on the floor near Pip's cushion with movements that were almost awkward in their careful precision, as though he were handling something fragile and dangerous in equal measure. "For your companion," he said, his voice gruff. "The kitchen prepares it for the hunting dogs." It seemed appropriate. Pip approached the offering with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging as he sampled the unexpected feast, and Lily found herself unable to form words. The Duke had left the supper table, gone to the kitchens himself rather than summoning a servant, and returned with food specifically selected for a creature he had once forbidden from his home. The gesture was so unexpected, so fundamentally at odds with the cold, controlled man who had married her for efficiency, that she felt something shift in her chest, a reorientation of understanding that left her momentarily breathless. "Thank you, Your Grace," she managed finally. "That is extraordinarily kind." "It is practical," he replied. But he would not meet her eyes, and his hand moved to adjust his already perfectly straight cuff with unnecessary force. A creature in your care requires proper nutrition. It would be inefficient for you to neglect your own meal to feed him scraps beneath the table. But his gaze lingered on Pip as the puppy ate with obvious pleasure, and Lily saw it again, that flicker of something beneath the ice. Not discomfort this time, but something that looked almost like longing, as though he were watching something he had lost and could not quite remember how to reclaim. "He judges no one," the Duke said suddenly, his voice so quiet she almost missed it beneath the sound of rain still pattering against the windows. "That is an enviable quality." And then, before she could respond, before she could ask what he meant or why he had said it, he excused himself from the table and left the small parlor, leaving Lily alone with Pip and a plate of venison and the growing certainty that her husband's coldness was not absence of feeling, but rather the presence of too much feeling, locked away so tightly that even he might not remember what lay beneath the ice. The announcement came during breakfast on a morning when frost had begun to pattern the windows with delicate tracery, a visual reminder that autumn was surrendering to winter's approach. The Duke set down his newspaper with the precise deliberation that characterized all his movements and regarded Lily across the expanse of white linen and fine china. "We depart for London in 3 days' time," he said, his tone carrying the flat certainty of a man accustomed to having his pronouncements met with immediate compliance. "The Countess of Albury hosts her annual charity gala. Our presence is expected." Lily's teacup paused halfway to her lips, her carefully cultivated composure threatening to fracture. London. The word carried weight beyond its simple geography, conjuring images of glittering ballrooms and poisonous gossip, of society matrons who had witnessed her humiliation and Lord Selwyn who had orchestrated it. She had been grateful for the isolation of Beaumont Hall, for the reprieve from judgment and whispered speculation. The thought of returning to that world, even armored in the protection of the Duke's name and fortune, filled her with a dread that sat heavy in her stomach. "How long will we be in residence?" She managed to keep her voice level, though her fingers tightened around the delicate porcelain with enough force that she feared it might crack. 4 days. Perhaps 5 if business requires additional attention. The Duke's eyes remained fixed on her face, with that penetrating quality she had come to recognize as his method of assessment. "The gala is politically significant. Several members of Parliament will attend, along with foreign dignitaries whose goodwill affects certain commercial interests. Your presence as my Duchess will be noted and remarked upon." The unspoken message was clear. This was her first test as his wife, her debut in the role she had accepted in exchange for protection and security. She would be scrutinized by the same society that had cast her out, examined for evidence that the cold Duke's mysterious marriage to a woman of modest circumstances was either a brilliant strategic move or an uncharacteristic lapse in judgment. Every aspect of her appearance and behavior would be dissected, analyzed, and judged. "Of course, Your Grace. I will ensure I am prepared to represent your household appropriately." Something flickered across his face, an expression she could not quite identify. "You will not be representing my household, madam. You will be representing yourself as my Duchess. There is a distinction." He folded his newspaper with mechanical precision. "I am aware that Lord Selwyn will be in attendance. If his presence causes you distress, you need only indicate as much, and I will ensure our interactions with him are minimized." The offer, delivered in his usual flat tone, nevertheless carried an undercurrent of something that might have been protectiveness. Lily felt a complicated warmth bloom in her chest. Gratitude mixed with the bitter awareness that the Duke's protection, however genuine, could not erase the memory of her public humiliation or the fear that Selwyn's cruelty might find new avenues of expression. "Thank you, Your Grace. That is considerate." After breakfast, Lily retreated to her apartments and sat with Pip in her lap, staring out at the frost-rimed gardens while her mind raced through implications and impossibilities. 4 days. Perhaps 5. She could not leave Pip behind, not for that length of time. Mrs. Rothwell and the staff had proven kind, but asking them to care for a creature whose presence remained technically unauthorized felt like an imposition too far. More than that, the thought of being separated from him while facing the ordeal of London society felt unbearable, as though she would be venturing into battle without her only reliable source of comfort. But bringing him presented its own catastrophic risks. The Duke had shown unexpected tolerance for Pip's presence at Beaumont Hall. But that tolerance existed within controlled circumstances, in the privacy of his own domain. A London townhouse would mean additional staff, temporary quarters, the constant proximity of society's watchful eyes. One servant's loose tongue, one moment of carelessness, and the scandal would spread like wildfire. The Duchess of Ashford, so desperate for affection that she smuggled a mongrel dog into society events like some lovesick girl clutching a forbidden novel. Yet as the day wore on and preparations for the journey consumed the household's attention, Lily found her resolve hardening into determination. She had already risked everything to keep Pip safe. She had deceived her husband, violated the terms of their agreement, and built an elaborate architecture of lies to protect one small creature's existence. What was one more risk when weighed against the alternative of abandoning him when he needed her most? The solution came to her while sorting through accessories for the journey, her hands falling upon a large muff of midnight blue velvet lined with rabbit fur, a gift from the Duke's modiste that she had never had occasion to use. The muff was capacious, designed for ladies of fashion who carried all manner of items within its warm depths. And when she experimentally placed Pip inside, he fit perfectly, his small body nestled in the soft lining with only his nose visible, if one looked carefully. "You must be absolutely silent," she whispered to him, stroking his ears as he gazed up at her with trusting eyes. "Not a sound, not a movement. Can you do that for me?" Pip licked her finger, which she chose to interpret as assent. The morning of departure arrived with the kind of gray, cheerless dawn that seemed designed to match Lily's apprehension. The traveling coach stood ready in the courtyard, an enormous conveyance of gleaming black lacquer and the Ashford coat of arms emblazoned on the doors, pulled by 4 matched greys whose breath steamed in the cold air. Servants loaded trunks with efficient precision, while the Duke supervised the operation with his usual exacting standards, ensuring that every item was secured properly and nothing left to chance. Lily descended the steps wrapped in a traveling cloak of deep burgundy wool, the velvet muff hanging from a ribbon at her wrist. Inside the muff, Pip lay curled and blessedly silent, sedated by a carefully measured dose of chamomile tea that the cook had recommended for nervous animals. His warmth pressed against her hands, his heartbeat a steady reassurance that she was not entirely alone in what lay ahead. "You have everything you require?" The Duke appeared at her elbow, his own traveling cloak making him seem even taller and more imposing than usual. "Yes, Your Grace. Your household has been most thorough in their preparations." His eyes moved to the muff, lingering there for a moment that stretched too long, and Lily felt her breath catch in her throat. Could he somehow sense the deception? Did he see the slight movement of fur through the velvet? Hear the infinitesimal sound of Pip's breathing? But then his gaze lifted back to her face, and whatever he might have noticed or suspected remained locked behind his customary reserve. "The journey will take approximately 6 hours, with changes of horses. We will stop for refreshment at the Crown and Heart. I trust you will inform me if you require any additional accommodations." He handed her into the coach with impersonal courtesy, his gloved fingers touching hers for the briefest moment before releasing her to settle onto the plush velvet seats. The interior of the coach was as luxurious as everything else the Duke owned, fitted with every comfort that wealth could provide. Yet Lily felt no ease as the door closed and the vehicle lurched into motion. She adjusted the muff in her lap, feeling Pip stir slightly before settling back into drugged sleep. Across from her, the Duke had already withdrawn a sheaf of papers from his case and begun reviewing them with his characteristic focus, apparently content to spend the journey in productive silence. But as the miles rolled past and Beaumont Hall disappeared behind them, Lily found herself unable to share his equanimity. They were traveling toward London, toward society, toward Lord Selwyn and the glittering world that had cast her out. She was smuggling a forbidden creature into the very heart of that world, risking not only scandal, but the fragile protection she had purchased with her name and her vows. The Duke glanced up from his papers, his gray eyes finding hers with that unsettling precision. "You seem anxious." "The prospect of London society after my previous experience there is not entirely comfortable, Your Grace." "You are no longer Miss Hayes of modest circumstances and dubious prospects." His tone remained flat, but something in his gaze intensified. "You are the Duchess of Ashford. My wealth, my position, my influence now shield you. Lord Selwyn, or anyone else who attempts to harm you, will find themselves opposed by resources they cannot match." The words should have provided comfort, and part of her was indeed reassured by the iron certainty in his voice. But she could not help thinking that his protection extended only to threats he could see and understand. The secret nestled in her muff, the small creature whose presence could unravel everything, remained a vulnerability he did not know to defend. "Thank you, Your Grace. Your protection means more than I can adequately express." He nodded once sharply and returned his attention to his papers. But Lily noticed that his gaze drifted toward her with increasing frequency as the journey progressed, and she wondered if he sensed the tension radiating from her, the fear that had nothing to do with Lord Selwyn and everything to do with the warm, living secret she carried toward an uncertain fate. Inside the muff, Pip slept on, trusting completely in her protection, unaware that he was being carried into the very den of those who would see him as evidence of his mistress's unsuitability, proof that the Duke's bride was exactly as pathetic and sentimental as society had always claimed. The Countess of Albury's ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles reflected in crystal chandeliers, their combined luminescence rendering the assembled guests in sharp relief against walls hung with silk the color of champagne. Lily had forgotten the particular quality of these gatherings, the way wealth and power compressed into a single space until the very air seemed to shimmer with consequence. Every woman wore jewels that could have fed a village for a year. Every man carried himself with the casual arrogance of inherited position, and the collective judgment of 300 of London's most influential citizens pressed down like a physical weight. She entered on the Duke's arm, her burgundy silk gown chosen specifically to project confidence she did not feel, the treacherous muff hanging from her wrist by its ribbon. Inside, Pip remained mercifully drowsy from the second carefully measured dose of chamomile, his small body warm against the fur lining, his presence both comfort and catastrophic liability. The Duke had not spoken during their preparation at the London townhouse, but she had noticed the way his gaze lingered on her reflection in the mirror, the slight tightening of his jaw that suggested some internal calculation she could not interpret. Now, as they moved through the receiving line, his hand at her elbow radiated controlled tension, and she wondered if he sensed her fear or merely found the social obligation as tedious as he had always claimed. "Your Grace, how delightful to see you," the Countess purred, her eyes sliding from the Duke to Lily with predatory assessment. "And the new Duchess." My dear, we have heard such interesting things about your marriage. I trust they were suitably boring, Lady Albury, the Duke replied with a flat precision that somehow transformed into cutting wit. I would hate for my private affairs to provide entertainment. The Countess laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and waved them into the ballroom where the orchestra played and couples moved through the figures of a quadrille with mechanical grace. For the first hour, Lily managed to maintain her composure through the gauntlet of introductions and barely concealed curiosity. She deflected questions about the speed of their courtship with practiced vagueness, smiled through thinly veiled insinuations about the Duke's motivations, and felt the weight of countless eyes cataloging every aspect of her appearance and deportment. The muff remained a constant presence, and she kept her hands positioned carefully to obscure any movement from within, her awareness of Pip's vulnerability sharpening every sense to painful acuity. The Duke remained at her side longer than protocol required, his presence a bulwark against the most aggressive inquiries. And she felt something loosen in her chest at this unexpected consideration. He was, she realized, shielding her in the only way he knew how, using his formidable reputation and social position as armor against those who would have dissected her more thoroughly in his absence. But even the Duke could not maintain constant vigilance. When Lord Pemberton cornered him to discuss some matter of parliamentary business, gesturing toward a quieter alcove with the urgency of a man who would not be denied, the Duke glanced at Lily with something that might have been apology. "I will return shortly. Do not wander far." And then she was alone, or as alone as one could be in a ballroom filled with hundreds. And that was when Lord Selwyn materialized from the crowd like some malevolent spirit summoned by her isolation. He had aged poorly in the months since Lady Penworth's tea, his dissipation evident in the puffiness beneath his eyes and the sallowness of his complexion. But his malice remained undimmed. He approached with the swagger of a man who had inflicted wounds before and anticipated the pleasure of reopening them, a smile playing at his lips that held no warmth, only the anticipation of cruelty. "Why, if it isn't the former Miss Hayes, elevated so unexpectedly to such lofty heights." His voice carried just far enough to draw the attention of nearby guests without appearing to deliberately cause a scene. Or, should I say, the Duchess of Ashford, though I confess, the transformation seems rather like putting a silk ribbon on a mongrel and calling it a purebred. Lily felt the blood drain from her face, but forced herself to meet his gaze with steady composure. "Lord Selwyn, I trust you are enjoying the gala." "Oh, immensely. Though I must confess surprise at your attendance. I had heard you developed quite the attachment to, shall we say, inappropriate companions, the kind that follow at one's heels and require constant attention." His eyes gleamed with malicious knowledge, and Lily's heart stuttered in her chest. How did he know? Had some servant gossiped? Had he somehow learned about Pip through the networks of information that flowed through London society like poison in veins? "I'm sure I don't take your meaning, my lord." "Don't you?" He stepped closer, and she caught the smell of brandy on his breath, the particular recklessness of a man emboldened by drink. "I heard the most amusing story about the new Duchess's peculiar habits. Something about a small, fluffy creature smuggled about in inappropriate circumstances. Really, madam, one would think marriage to such an elevated personage would cure you of your pathetic need for—" His hand shot out with sudden violence, grasping for the muff that hung at her wrist. Lily jerked backward, but his fingers caught the velvet, and inside she felt Pip stir, startled from his drugged sleep by the sudden motion. The puppy let out a small, frightened yap, the sound cutting through the nearby conversations with damning clarity. "There it is," Selwyn crowed, triumphant and vicious. "The famous mongrel smuggled into the Countess's ball like some shameful secret. Let's have a look at the creature that means more to you than dignity or—" He never finished the sentence. The Duke appeared with a speed that defied the laws governing the movement of civilized men in formal settings, his hand clamping around Selwyn's wrist with enough force that Lily heard bones grind together. The transformation that overtook her husband's face was absolute and terrifying, every trace of civilized restraint evaporating to reveal something primal and deadly beneath. His eyes, usually so controlled, blazed with fury that seemed to literally heat the air between them. And his voice, when it emerged, carried across the suddenly silent ballroom with the force of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Touch her, puppy, and you die." The words rang through the vast space, silencing the orchestra mid-phrase, freezing dancers in mid-step, commanding the absolute attention of every person present. The Duke's hand remained locked around Selwyn's wrist, his grip visibly tightening until the other man's face contorted with pain. And there was nothing civilized in his expression. Nothing of the cold, controlled peer who valued order above all things. This was rage in its purest form, protective and absolute and utterly terrifying in its intensity. "Your Grace, I was merely—" Selwyn began, his voice cracking with fear and pain. "You were attempting to harm something under my protection." The Duke's voice dropped lower, more dangerous for its quiet fury. "You were threatening my wife with public humiliation. You were demonstrating the same vicious cruelty that led you to destroy her reputation when she had no one to defend her." He released Selwyn's wrist with enough force that the man stumbled backward, nearly falling. "But she is not alone now. She is mine. And anything that brings her comfort, anything that provides her solace, anything she chooses to value, be it a puppy or a pebble or a blade of grass, is under my absolute protection." Selwyn clutched his wrist, his face mottling with humiliation and rage. Around them, the assembled guests stood frozen in tableau, 300 witnesses to the cold Duke's shocking display of emotion. Lily felt the world tilt sideways, her carefully constructed understanding of her husband shattering like glass under hammer blows. "You would threaten murder over a mongrel dog?" Selwyn spat, trying to salvage some dignity from his rout. The Duke stepped forward, and something in his movement made Selwyn flinch backward. "I would end anyone who attempted to harm what is precious to her. Test that statement at your peril." He turned to Lily, and she saw his hand trembling slightly as he reached for her. This man who never trembled, whose control was legendary. His fingers closed around hers with desperate gentleness, and she felt the rapid hammer of his pulse where his wrist pressed against her palm. "We are leaving," he said, his voice rough with emotion he could no longer contain. "Now." He led her through the silent ballroom, their exit witnessed by 300 pairs of shocked eyes, and Lily clutched the muff against her chest, feeling Pip's frightened heartbeat through the velvet. Behind them, conversation erupted in waves, scandalized and fascinated in equal measure. But she heard none of it, aware only of the Duke's hand gripping hers with desperate intensity, of the way his shoulders remained rigid with barely leashed violence, of the fact that he had just destroyed his reputation for emotional control in the most public venue imaginable. For her. For Pip. For something he had claimed not to care about, had forbidden from his home, had described as frivolous and unnecessary. In the carriage, as they lurched into motion, the Duke released her hand and pressed his palms against his knees, his breath coming in ragged gasps that suggested a man fighting for control after complete surrender. Lily removed Pip from the muff, cradling the trembling puppy against her chest, and when she looked at her husband, she saw his mask had not yet returned. saw everything he usually kept buried rising to the surface like floodwaters overtopping banks. "Your Grace," she whispered. "Why?" He looked at her finally, and his eyes held a desolation so profound that her breath caught. "Because," he said, his voice breaking on the word, "I know what it is to have the things you love destroyed to teach you not to feel. And I will not permit that lesson to be taught to you. Not ever. Not while I have breath in my body." And in that moment, sitting in the swaying carriage with Pip between them and London falling away behind, Lily understood that her husband's coldness had never been absence, but armor. Protection against a cruelty far worse than anything Lord Selwyn could devise. The silence in the carriage felt alive, pressing against them with the weight of everything unspoken. Lily held Pip close, feeling his small body gradually calm as the distance from the ballroom increased. But her eyes remained fixed on the Duke. He sat rigid across from her, his hands still pressed against his knees, his breathing slowly returning to something approaching normal. But his face remained unguarded in a way she had never witnessed, as though the effort of reconstructing his mask required more strength than he currently possessed. "Why?" The word emerged from her lips before she could consider its wisdom, raw with confusion and wonder. "Your Grace, why did you do that? You destroyed your reputation in that ballroom. They will talk of nothing else for months. The cold Duke, they call you, and you just—" Her voice caught. "You threatened murder over a puppy. You publicly claimed him as worthy of your protection. Why?" The Duke's hands clenched into fists against his thighs, his jaw working as though he were physically fighting the words that wanted to escape. For a long moment, she thought he would retreat into silence, would rebuild his walls and dismiss her question with some practical explanation that explained nothing. But then his eyes lifted to meet hers, and what she saw there stole the breath from her lungs. "I had a dog once," he said, his voice emerging rough and unsteady, as though scraped across broken glass. "A spaniel. I was 7 years old when my mother gave her to me. I named her Constance because even at that age, I understood the value of loyalty, of constancy in a world that provided precious little of either." Lily's throat tightened, some instinct warning her that what was coming would be terrible, that she was about to witness the excavation of a wound that had never properly healed. "My father was not a warm man. He believed that sentiment was weakness, that emotional attachment was a liability to be eliminated through discipline and control." The Duke's voice remained flat, but his hands trembled where they gripped his knees. He tolerated Constance's presence for 6 months. Then one day, he observed me crying when she was ill with a fever. He saw me sitting with her through the night, refusing to leave her side, choosing her comfort over my lessons and responsibilities. "Your Grace," Lily whispered. But he continued as though he had not heard her, the words pouring out with the terrible momentum of a confession too long suppressed. The next morning, Constance was gone. My father informed me at breakfast that the dog had been removed from the estate and destroyed. He said it with the same tone he might have used to report the weather. He told me that I had demonstrated an attachment that compromised my development as a future Duke, that I had allowed emotion to supersede duty, and that such weakness must be corrected before it became permanently ingrained. The Duke's breath hitched, a sound of such raw pain that Lily felt tears spring to her eyes. He said that if I ever displayed such weakness again, he would ensure I learned the lesson more thoroughly. I was 7 years old, and I learned that day that love was not merely inadvisable, it was dangerous, deadly. that the things I loved could be taken and destroyed specifically to punish me for loving them. The carriage wheels rattled over cobblestones, the sound somehow distant, as though they existed in a separate reality from the rest of the world. Pip shifted in Lily's arms, and the Duke's eyes fixed on the puppy with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. I built myself into what my father demanded. I eliminated sentiment. I controlled every emotional impulse. I became cold and calculating and utterly disciplined because the alternative was to risk attachment. And attachment meant loss, meant pain, meant the systematic destruction of everything soft and vulnerable. His voice broke completely on the last word. I became the cold Duke because warmth had been beaten and frightened and starved out of me because I learned that feeling anything was to invite suffering. "Oh, Corvus," Lily breathed, using his given name for the first time, and his eyes snapped to hers at the sound of it. "And then you arrived," he continued, his words tumbling faster now, as though a dam had broken and everything behind it was flooding forth. "You came into my home with your gentle kindness and your unconditional devotion to a creature the world deemed worthless. You risked everything, your security, your position, my displeasure, to protect something small and helpless. You demonstrated the very quality my father had tried to destroy in me, the capacity to love without calculation, to care without counting the cost." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his face closer to hers now, and she could see the tracks of moisture on his cheeks, tears he did not bother to hide or wipe away. "When I saw Pip that first day in the library, when he licked my hand with such fearless affection, I felt something I had not permitted myself to feel in 30 years. I felt the echo of that child who had loved Constance, who had believed love was possible and good and worth protecting. And it terrified me." His laugh was bitter, broken. So I told myself it was practical to permit his presence. I told myself I was merely avoiding unnecessary conflict. I lied to myself with the same ruthless discipline I had applied to every other aspect of my existence. "But tonight," Lily whispered, "tonight, you could not lie anymore. Tonight I saw a cruel man attempting to destroy something you loved, attempting to humiliate you for the crime of caring about something vulnerable. And I saw my father's face in his." The Duke's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I saw that 7-year-old boy who had lost everything that mattered. And I realized that if I permitted Selwyn to harm Pip, if I allowed you to suffer that same lesson, that love makes you weak, that caring invites destruction, I would be complicit in perpetuating my father's cruelty. I would be allowing the cycle to continue." He reached out slowly, his hand hovering in the space between them, and then with visible effort, he placed it gently on Pip's small head. The puppy, sensing no threat, licked his fingers with the same guileless affection he had shown in the library, and Lily watched her husband's face crumple, watched 30 years of carefully constructed armor finally shatter completely. "Pip represents everything I was taught to destroy in myself," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Innocence, trust, the capacity for uncomplicated affection. And you." He looked up at her, his gray eyes swimming with tears he no longer tried to contain. "You protect him with such fierce devotion, you risk everything to keep him safe. And in doing so, you show me what I could have been if my father had not taken Constance. You show me what warmth looks like when it is not beaten into submission." "Corvus," she said again, setting Pip gently on the seat beside her so she could reach for his hands. They were cold and trembling, and she wrapped them in hers, offering what comfort touch could provide. "I am so sorry. What was done to you was monstrous and cruel, and you deserved none of it." "I need him," the Duke said, the confession emerging as barely more than a breath. "I need Pip's presence as proof that gentleness can survive, that love does not always end in destruction. I need him because he reminds me that the child I was still exists somewhere beneath all this ice, and that perhaps I do not have to remain frozen forever." He gripped her hands with desperate intensity. "And I need you, Lily. God help me. I need you with an intensity that terrifies me. I need your warmth and your light and your capacity to care about creatures the world deems worthless. I need the way you see value where others see only weakness." "You love me," she said softly, and it was not a question. "I love you so completely that I can barely breathe with it," he confessed, his voice breaking. "I love you so fiercely that I threatened murder in a ballroom filled with witnesses. I love you so desperately that I can no longer maintain the pretense that this marriage is merely practical. You have become essential to my existence, and the thought of losing you, of having you taken away as punishment for my attachment." He shuddered violently. "It is my deepest terror and my most profound weakness, and I can no longer hide it." Lily felt tears streaming down her own face now, her heart expanding with a combination of grief for his past and joy for this impossible present. She released one of his hands to cup his face, forcing him to meet her eyes fully. "Then we are equally vulnerable," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "Because I love you too, Corvus. I love the man beneath the ice, the one who brings venison for a puppy and builds stronger fences to keep small creatures safe. I love the husband who threatens murder to protect what matters to me. I love you with the same reckless devotion I have always reserved for Pip, and I am no longer afraid of what that means." Something shifted in his expression, wonder replacing the raw pain, and slowly, carefully, as though approaching something precious and fragile, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was nothing like the perfunctory touch that had sealed their marriage vows. This was need and relief and the desperate communion of two people who had found unexpected salvation in each other's arms. When they finally pulled apart, Pip had curled up between them on the seat, a small white bridge connecting their separate spaces. The Duke reached down and gathered the puppy into his arms, holding him with the careful tenderness of a man handling something infinitely precious. "Thank you," he whispered. And Lily understood he was speaking to them both, to her for showing him that love was possible, and to Pip for being the innocent creature that had cracked through 30 years of ice to reach the boy who had never stopped grieving for Constance. "We protect each other now," Lily said, placing her hand over his where it cradled Pip. "All three of us. A family built on fierce protection and shared vulnerability." The Duke nodded, unable to speak, and they rode through the London night in silence, wrapped in the warmth of truth finally spoken and love finally acknowledged, while the small white puppy slept peacefully between them, unaware that he had saved not one lost soul, but two. 3 weeks after their return from London, Beaumont Hall had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The change was not in the physical structure of the house, which remained as pristine and elegant as ever, but in the quality of the silence that filled its rooms. Where once there had been the cold quiet of emotional absence, now there existed the warm stillness of contentment, punctuated by small sounds that would have been unthinkable mere months before. Lily's laughter drifting from the music room where she had begun playing the pianoforte again. The Duke's low voice reading aloud in the library, while she sat beside him with needlework in her lap. And most shocking of all, the occasional sound of Pip's excited barking as he explored his expanded territory with the fearless enthusiasm of a creature who knew himself loved. The Duke had not rebuilt his walls. Lily watched him daily, half expecting the old coldness to reassert itself once the shock of his confession had faded. But instead he seemed to be learning how to live without the armor that had protected and imprisoned him for so long. He was awkward in it sometimes, this new emotional vulnerability, like a man learning to walk after years of paralysis, but he persisted with the same discipline he had once applied to maintaining control, now redirected toward the infinitely more difficult task of remaining open. On a crisp November morning, Lily stood at her dressing room window watching the Duke cross the courtyard toward the stables, Pip trotting at his heels with proprietary devotion. The sight still filled her with wonder. Her husband, the legendary Cold Duke, had taken to including the puppy in his morning inspections of the estate, and the staff had grown accustomed to seeing their formidable master pause to ensure the small creature could keep pace, or to point out some interesting scent that might warrant investigation. She was smiling at this tableau when she heard it. A tremendous crash from the direction of the stables, followed by a sound that turned her blood to ice. Pip's terrified yelping, high and frantic and continuous. She was running before conscious thought intervened, her morning dress tangling around her legs as she flew down the stairs and across the courtyard, her heart hammering against her ribs with primal fear. The stable yard was in chaos when she arrived. Grooms and stable hands clustered around the entrance to the hay barn, and through the press of bodies she could see a horrifying sight. A massive stack of hay bales had collapsed, their combined weight crushing everything beneath. And from somewhere within that mountain of compacted fodder came Pip's increasingly desperate cries, weaker now, fading. "Get back!" The Duke's voice cut through the commotion with whip-crack authority. He had already shed his coat and was climbing onto the unstable pile, his hands grasping at the heavy bales with desperate strength. The whole stack could shift. Everyone back. "Your Grace, it's too dangerous," Matthews called, his face pale with fear. "Let us get ropes. Organize. There is no time." The Duke heaved at a bale that must have weighed twice what a man could safely lift, his face contorting with effort. The bale shifted, but the ones above it groaned ominously, threatening to cascade down and bury him along with the trapped puppy. He did not stop, did not even pause to consider his own safety, and Lily watched in horror as he wrenched another bale free, then another, his hands bleeding now from the rough twine, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Corvus, please," she cried. But he gave no indication of hearing her, his entire being focused on the sound of Pip's frightened whimpering, growing fainter with each passing second. The stack shifted suddenly, violently, and several bales tumbled toward the Duke. He threw up his arm to protect his head, but kept digging with his free hand, blood running down his forearm from where the twine had torn his skin. And then, finally, he reached down into a gap he had created and pulled forth a small, dusty, terrified creature who immediately pressed against his chest with desperate relief. "I have him," the Duke gasped, cradling Pip with exquisite care even as the rest of the stack groaned threateningly above him. "I have him." He half climbed, half slid down from the unstable pile, and the moment his feet touched solid ground, the entire remaining structure collapsed with a thunderous crash exactly where he had been standing moments before. The grooms erupted in exclamations of relief and shock. But Lily could only stare at her husband, at the blood on his hands and the tears streaming down his dirt-smudged face as he held the shaking puppy against his heart. "Is he hurt?" the Duke demanded, his voice breaking. "Lily, is he injured?" She moved to him on trembling legs, her hands running over Pip's small body with practiced efficiency even as tears blurred her vision. "No. Bruised, terrified, but whole. He's whole." She looked up at her husband's ravaged face. "You could have died. That entire stack could have buried you." "I know." He did not look at her, his entire attention focused on Pip, who was beginning to calm now, licking the Duke's hand with weak but determined affection. "I knew, and I did not care. The thought of him crushed beneath that weight, of him dying afraid and alone because I had brought him to the stables, because I had failed to protect him." His voice shattered completely. "I could not bear it. I would rather die myself than let him suffer what Constance suffered." "Corvus." Lily placed her hands over his where they cradled Pip. "Look at me." He raised his eyes finally, and what she saw there stole her breath. Not the cold control he had worn for 30 years, not even the careful vulnerability he had been practicing since his confession, but something raw and true and utterly undefended. This was his heart, exposed completely, and it was magnificent in its terrible honesty. "I love him," the Duke said, his voice rough with emotion. "I love this small, foolish creature who chases mice into dangerous places. I love the way he trusts without question, loves without conditions, forgives without hesitation. I love him because he is everything good and innocent that I thought had died in me 30 years ago." He drew a shuddering breath. "And I love you, Lily. I love you with the same desperate, reckless devotion I just demonstrated in that hay barn. I love you so completely that your pain is my pain. Your joy is my joy. And the thought of losing you is more terrifying than any physical danger could ever be." "I love you too," she whispered, her hands tightening on his. "I love the man who risks himself to save a puppy. I love the husband who has learned to feel again despite everything his father did to destroy that capacity. I love you, Corvus, with all the fierce, protective devotion I have always reserved for the vulnerable creatures of this world. And you, my darling, are the most vulnerable of all, because you have finally let down your walls." He kissed her then, heedless of the watching grooms and stable hands, heedless of the blood on his hands and the dirt on his clothes and the absolute destruction of any remaining pretense of ducal dignity. He kissed her with Pip pressed between them, the three of them forming a small, tight circle of protection and love and shared survival. When they finally pulled apart, the Duke looked down at the puppy in his arms, who had recovered enough to wag his tail tentatively. "I am not the cold Duke anymore," he said. And it was not a question, but a statement of fact, of transformation completed. I cannot be. Not when my heart beats outside my chest in two separate bodies, one human and one canine, both infinitely precious and perpetually at risk. "No," Lily agreed, wiping tears from his cheeks with gentle fingers. "You are something far better. You are the man who loves without restraint, who protects without calculation, who has learned that vulnerability is not weakness, but the greatest courage of all." They walked back to the house together, Pip cradled carefully in the Duke's arms, and Lily noticed how the staff watched them with expressions that combined shock and warmth, and something that looked almost like pride. The cold Duke had died in that hay barn, and in his place stood a man who had chosen love over safety. who had risked everything for a creature society deemed worthless, who had finally, after 30 years of frozen grief, allowed himself to thaw completely. That evening, as they sat together in the small parlor that had become their sanctuary, Pip sprawled across both their laps in a display of absolute trust. The Duke took Lily's hand and held it with the kind of desperate gentleness that spoke of miracles barely believed. "I spent 30 years building walls to protect myself from pain," he said quietly. "But those walls also kept out joy, kept out connection, kept out everything that makes existence worth enduring. You and Pip have taught me that protection without love is merely a different kind of death. That safety purchased at the cost of feeling is no safety at all." "And you have taught me," Lily replied, stroking Pip's soft fur, "that I am worthy of fierce protection, that my capacity to love is not weakness, but strength, and that the right person will not merely tolerate my vulnerabilities, but will risk everything to defend them. We are a family," the Duke said, and the words emerged with the kind of reverent certainty usually reserved for prayer, not the cold, practical arrangement I once thought marriage should be, but a true family, built on fierce protection and shared vulnerability and love so deep it frightens me with its intensity. "Yes," Lily agreed, leaning against his shoulder while Pip sighed contentedly between them. "We are exactly that. A family that almost wasn't, saved by one small creature who refused to believe that love was dangerous, who insisted on offering affection even when it was forbidden, who taught a frozen man how to feel again." The Duke pressed his lips to her hair, his arms encompassing both her and Pip in an embrace that spoke of promises made and kept, of walls demolished and hearts mended, of love that had been tested in the fire of fear and emerged stronger for the trial. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on me when I was determined to remain frozen, for showing me what warmth looks like, for loving me despite everything I tried to be." "Thank you," she replied, "for becoming who you truly are, for choosing us over safety, for proving that even the coldest heart can learn to burn." Outside, winter was settling over Beaumont Hall with its customary severity. But inside, in the small parlor where a Duke and Duchess and one small white puppy formed their own constellation of love and protection, spring had already arrived. 5 years had transformed Beaumont Hall from a fortress of cold perfection into something far more precious. A home where warmth resided not merely in the hearths that burned in every room, but in the quality of laughter that echoed through the corridors and the easy affection that passed between its master and mistress like a language only they could fully comprehend. The house retained its elegance, its surfaces still gleamed with meticulous care. But now the rigid formality had been softened by small touches that spoke of lives actually lived within these walls. Fresh flowers arranged with more enthusiasm than precision, books left open on side tables, and most notably, the occasional sound of animals moving through spaces once maintained in sterile silence. The annual gathering had become legendary among London society, spoken of with a mixture of bemusement and genuine affection. Every autumn, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford opened Beaumont Hall for 3 days of celebration, and the invitations bore a single line that had become famous throughout the realm. "All companions, human and otherwise, are most welcome." It was not unusual to see lords and ladies arriving with dogs on leads, cats in traveling baskets, and on one memorable occasion, a minor baronet who brought his African gray parrot that provided running commentary on the proceedings with shocking accuracy. This year's gathering was in full swing. The drawing rooms filled with guests who moved between conversations with the easy grace of people genuinely enjoying themselves rather than enduring social obligation. Lily stood near the windows overlooking the gardens, watching as Lord Pemberton's elderly retriever played gently with the young spaniel belonging to the Countess of Albury's daughter. And she felt the familiar warmth of satisfaction bloom in her chest. This gathering had begun as a quiet rebellion against society's strictures, a statement that vulnerability and affection were not weaknesses to be hidden, but strengths to be celebrated. Now it had become something larger, a sanctuary where people could bring the creatures they loved without fear of judgment or ridicule. "You are smiling," the Duke's voice came from behind her, low and warm, and she felt his hand settle at the small of her back with the easy intimacy of long familiarity. "That particular smile, the one that tells me you are plotting something benevolent." She turned to face her husband, taking in the sight of him with the kind of pleasure that had not diminished across 5 years of marriage. He had aged, as all men do, with silver threading through his dark hair at the temples and fine lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting against the sun during their morning walks. But the coldness that had once defined him had been replaced by something infinitely more attractive. The weathered warmth of a man who had learned to live fully, to feel deeply, and to love without reservation. "I was thinking about Lord Pemberton," she said, gesturing toward the window. "Do you remember? He once wrote to offer me a position as governess, noting that pets were naturally forbidden in a household devoted to proper education." The Duke's expression shifted into something that combined amusement with a harder edge. "I remember. I also remember ensuring that several of his business ventures encountered unexpected difficulties until he learned to mind his own affairs and treat animals with more consideration." "Corvus," Lily said, though her tone held no real reproach. "You cannot ruin every person who has ever slighted me or spoken ill of animals." "I can, actually. I have both the resources and the inclination." But his eyes crinkled with warmth, and he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Though I confess my capacity for vengeance has been somewhat dampened by contentment. It is difficult to maintain proper fury when one is this happy." They were interrupted by Mrs. Rothwell, who approached with the kind of comfortable familiarity that spoke of years of loyal service and genuine affection. "Your Grace, the Earl of Blackwood has arrived with what he describes as a small surprise. I thought you should be warned that the surprise appears to be 3 puppies." The Duke's eyebrows rose. 3? His estate's hunting dog had an unexpected litter, and he thought perhaps we might appreciate their company. Mrs. Rothwell's lips twitched with suppressed amusement. "They are currently destroying the arrangement in the front hall." "Of course they are," Lily said, already moving toward the door. "I should greet our new guests properly." Later, after the puppies had been appropriately welcomed and the formal dinner had concluded with the kind of easy conversation that came from guests genuinely comfortable in their surroundings, Lily found the Duke in his study. This room had once been a monument to rigid order, every book precisely placed, every surface clear of clutter. Now it bore the accumulated evidence of a life lived. Correspondence stacked for review, a half-finished game of chess set up on the side table, and most notably, an elderly white Maltese sleeping peacefully on a cushion beside the hearth. Pip had aged with grace, his muzzle gone gray, his movements slower but still purposeful when he chose to move at all. These days he spent most of his time sleeping in the Duke's study, a position of honor he had claimed through years of devoted companionship. The Duke had arranged his schedule around the dog's needs, ensuring he was present for Pip's morning walk and evening meal. And Lily had watched with endless tenderness as her husband learned to accept the inevitable approach of loss with the same fierce devotion he had once brought to protection. He was dreaming, the Duke said softly as Lily entered, gesturing toward Pip, whose paws twitched slightly in sleep. "Chasing rabbits, I suspect." though he has not had the energy for such pursuits in months. Lily moved to stand beside her husband's chair, her hand settling on his shoulder. He has had a good life, a life filled with love and safety and the certainty that he is cherished. Because of you. The Duke reached up to cover her hand with his. You risked everything to give him that life. You defied me, deceived me, smuggled him into places where he had no business being, all because you could not bear the thought of him suffering. And you saved him, Lily replied. You risked your life in that hay barn. You chose him over your own safety. I chose love over fear, the Duke corrected quietly. I chose the family we had become over the isolation I had maintained for 30 years. It was not a difficult choice in the end. The difficult part was allowing myself to make it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the elderly dog sleep. And Lily thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about the desperate woman who had smuggled a puppy into a marriage of convenience, and the frozen man who had forbidden pets from his home. She thought about the transformation that had occurred not through grand gestures, but through small acts of courage repeated daily. The decision to remain vulnerable, to choose feeling over numbness, to protect what was precious, even when protection meant risking everything. Society still calls you the cold Duke, she said softly. I heard it this evening, whispered behind fans. They do not understand the change in you. The Duke's hand tightened on hers. Let them whisper. I know the truth, and so do you. I am cold only in the sense that winter is cold. I carry ice in my memory, in the scars my father left, in the knowledge of what cruelty can do to innocence. But I also carry fire, Lily. I carry the warmth you and Pip brought into my life, the heat of love that burns steady and fierce and refuses to be extinguished no matter how much fear tells me it should be. He stood and drew her into his arms, holding her with the kind of desperate gentleness that had become his signature expression of affection. They can call me cold if they wish, but I know that every day I wake up and choose to feel, choose to love, choose to protect the small family we have built. I know that the heart I almost lost is the one I fight for every single day. Lily pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of that hard-won heart. We fight for each other. That is what families do. Yes, he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. That is exactly what families do. Pip stirred on his cushion, lifting his gray muzzle to regard them with eyes that had grown cloudy with age, but still held the same boundless trust and affection they had always carried. The Duke released Lily and moved to kneel beside the elderly dog, stroking his soft fur with exquisite tenderness. Thank you, he whispered to Pip, as he had done countless times over the years. Thank you for refusing to believe that love was dangerous. Thank you for teaching me how to feel again. Pip's tail thumped weakly against the cushion, and he pressed his small head against the Duke's hand with the kind of contentment that came from a life lived in absolute security and love. That night, as they prepared for bed, Lily watched her husband moving through the familiar routine of checking windows and banking fires, and she marveled at the man he had become. He was not perfect. He still struggled sometimes with the instinct to retreat behind walls, still fought against the fear that loving meant losing. But he fought those battles with the same fierce determination he brought to everything, and he won more often than he lost. What are you thinking? He asked, catching her watching him. I am thinking that I would make the same choice again, she said. That if I were back in that cottage with nothing but Pip and desperation, knowing everything that would follow, I would still accept your proposal. I would still smuggle him into your home. I would still risk everything for the chance at this life. The Duke crossed to where she sat and knelt before her, taking her hands in his. And I am thinking that I am grateful beyond words that you did. That you refused to abandon what you loved. That you taught me through your fierce devotion what it means to protect rather than merely control. You saved me, Lily. You and that small creature sleeping in my study saved me from a life that was not truly life at all, but merely existence wrapped in expensive clothing and rigid discipline. We saved each other, Lily corrected, cupping his face in her hands. And we continue to save each other every day, through the choice to remain vulnerable and open and willing to feel everything. The joy and the fear and the terrible, wonderful love that makes existence worth all its risks. He kissed her then, and in that kiss lived all the years of their unlikely love, all the transformations and revelations and small daily miracles that had brought them from that first cold transaction to this warm, genuine union. When they finally drew apart, he rested his forehead against hers and smiled with the kind of uncomplicated joy he had once believed impossible. "The warmest of souls," he murmured. "That is what you called him once, Pip. You said the truest measure of worth was not found in grand fortune, but in the unwavering love of a small, fluffy heart." "And I was right," Lily replied, "though I did not know then that I would find such love in two hearts, one canine and one human, both equally precious, both equally essential to my survival." Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows of Beaumont Hall. But inside, wrapped in warmth and love and the hard-won peace of transformation completed, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford held each other close and knew that they had found something rarer than all the wealth in England. A love that had been tested and refined and emerged stronger for every trial. A family that had been chosen rather than inherited. And a happiness that had been fought for rather than simply received. And in the study below, an elderly white dog slept peacefully on his cushion by the hearth, dreaming perhaps of the young puppy he had been, or perhaps simply resting in the absolute certainty that he was loved beyond measure and would be protected until the very end, by two humans who had learned from him the greatest lesson of all, that love given without calculation is the only love worth having, and that the smallest creatures often carry the largest hearts. You just spent over an hour with me. You watched Lily risk everything for love. You saw Corvus shatter 30 years of ice and learn to feel again. You witnessed Pip save 2 broken souls just by existing. You felt every emotion I carefully crafted for you, the fear, the hope, the devastating confession, the triumphant rescue, the peaceful ending. And now you're going to scroll away without subscribing? Really? After everything we just went through together? Here's the brutal truth. If you don't subscribe, you're telling me this story, this hour of your life, this emotional journey we took together, meant nothing. And that actually breaks my heart. Hit subscribe. Show me this mattered to you as much as it mattered to me. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Victorian Royal Stories team.